So let's talk through the top 10 strongest armies in Warhammer 40k currently. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about some of the strongest Warhammer 40k armies around, these being the ones that would give you the best chance of winning games at a tournament or something if you take some of their strongest lists that they can bring to bear. I made a very similar video to this one towards the end of the Nephilim season, but seeing as Arks of Omen has basically turned the entire meta of Warhammer 40k on its head, the old one is rather redundant now. In fact, there's only 3 entries on that previous top 10 that make it into this one. In general, I'd say that 40k balance in Arks of Omen is looking fairly good so far. For the most part, the majority of factions at least have a few good builds, and are somewhere within Games Workshop's usual target of 45 to 55% win rates. A few are definitely nosing ahead of the pack though I'd say that perhaps most of the ones that are trailing aren't doing so by quite so much. In this video, we'll focus on the top end of the meta, talking through the top armies, focusing on tournament win percentage as the primary metric, but also bearing in mind how many events that they're winning and roughly how regularly played they are. For each army, we'll talk through some of their strengths and weaknesses, and perhaps some of the most important recent developments that have brought them to where they are. First up, here are just a few armies that really weren't so far behind some of them here. There really is quite a cluster of them, sitting around about the 48 to 51% win percentage. Imperial Knights, Black Templars, Salamanders and Tau Empire are all doing fine, and Harlequins, Leaguers of Votan and World Eaters, despite their limited data, are just behind the top of the list as well. Will be interesting to see where the World Eaters shake out in all of this. A very different codex with a whole load of violent damage output, but maybe not quite so many options compared with some. In any case though, let's jump straight into it, and we'll start with the 10th place on the list. So first up, we have the Tainted Titans of the Chaos Knights. They just nosed ahead very slightly in terms of tournament win rates compared with the previous ones, jumping up to 51%, though they still haven't won any grand tournaments in Arks of Omen so far at time of recording. They have had a few high placings. It seems like they're an army that maybe is generally quite good at doing fairly well, but maybe held back a little bit at the very highest levels of play perhaps. In terms of player rates, they're at least fairly common in Arks of Omen, being the 11th most played army, not one of the absolute top though. Though I would say that that isn't too bad for a slightly niche faction that doesn't have a whole load of people collecting them. In terms of army strength, just having an entire army that's all dedicated to big damage dealers is generally quite a nice thing. If the enemy doesn't have enough anti-armor, they're going to struggle to some extent, and they can augment their already powerful datasheets with things like demonic favors to customize their knights, relics, warlord traits, and their dread abilities to hand out some slightly horrendous debuffs to enemies with low leadership. For downsides for the faction, those dread abilities can be a bit underwhelming against very high leadership foes, say things like Necrons or Custodes for example. Knights in general do have a fair few problems as well. They've got hard counters in certain armies like Imperial Guard with all their auto wounding, Votan with their judgment tokens, and demons tend to match up against them quite well as well. For the most part, Knights aren't the biggest fans of terrain as well. Their War Dogs have to go around it with ruins and things, and anything super heavy can come out on the wrong side of the obscuring terrain rules. In general though, at least in terms of tournament data and things, it does seem to be a bit of an uptick for them in Arks of Omen. Probably at least partly due to their secondaries getting quite significantly better. I feel like that was one of the main things that really held them back compared with the Imperials, and they actually seem to be doing a little bit better than their loyalist brothers now, at least on the competitive scene. A fair few lists do run a few big knights and plenty of small war dogs, though at least a few of the top lists just go very heavy on the war dogs, running basically nothing but. They are probably the most efficient datasheet in the codex. The carnivores, brigands, executioners, and the huntsmen and stalkers are all usable I think, depending on what you need them for. Out of the big knights I'd be most tempted by things like the Abominant with its massive tankiness with the Feel No Pain, or maybe the Rampager or Desecrator. Ranked in 9th place, with just the differential of having won more grand tournaments, we've got the Imperial Guard. They seem to be holding pretty steady as an upper mid-tier army, though not really one of the top factions in the game. In quite a good spot I think, with a win percentage of 51% as well, and having taken down 2 5-round tournaments in Arks of Omen. Guard are very popular at the moment, the second most played army in Arks of Omen on the tournament scene. I feel like there's a bit of an exuberance for them now they've actually got their shiny new units like the Rogor Dawn and Rough Riders and Leontus and things. A lot of Guard players have been waiting for a very long time for decent rules this edition, so I think a lot of people are looking forward to putting their armies on the table. The main thing that the Imperial Guard just do really well is raw shooting damage output. Perhaps the most efficient damage dealers in the codex are the Ruthies with things like plasma cannons and maybe a Vanquisher or two on the turrets. But souped up Kazakin can be insanely scary as well with their big mortal wound damage output. Lord Solar can hand out some powerful rerolls and orders. Company command squads with that Finial relic, maybe giving some buffs to some ignores line of sight firepower like mortars are quite nice, and to hold the line a few infantry bodies and maybe some sentinels in the midfield to take those objectives. Born soldiers can be a bit of a problem for any armies that are mainly relying on their toughness to stop the guard from killing them. Auto wounding on 6s is pretty handy against things like knights or certain armies like demons or orcs. The orders can be very flexible, giving you extra speed, durability or damage when you need it, and the guard do have some pretty strong secondaries on the go as well, particularly in flexible command, where if you can keep your officers safe, then you're in for a very easy 15 points out of that. As for downsides for the guard, they don't really have a whole load to speak of in terms of melee power. The Rough Riders are dangerous but quite fragile, and they don't really have a lot else that's massively efficient on that front in my opinion. They also are in a bit of an awkward position where the vast majority of their units just don't really want to get much closer to the enemy. Infantry squads can move out there but aren't really all that hard to remove, and sentinels are nice and tough but aren't really all that great at taking objectives. Overall, everything's generally looking at least fairly solid for the guard at the moment. It's cool to see them on the table, with units like Kazakin, the Rogor Dawn, and Lord Solar actually being released now, so allowed to be played in tournaments. Hopefully they shall remain in a fairly decent spot for the rest of the edition, now they've had so much time without a 9th edition codex. Moving onwards and upwards, in 8th place we have the Craftworld Eldar. For these ones I decided to exclude the Ynnari, which we might get to later. The Eldari are sitting on around about a 51% win percentage, but they do seem to be doing very well at winning grand tournaments in Arks of Omen pretty prolifically. They've taken down 6 so far. I feel that usually when you have a bit of a high disparity between loads of tournament wins but a kind of middling win percentage, it usually means that the faction's a bit of a higher skill one to use perhaps. Just picking it up and not really knowing the subtleties might mean that you just don't get all that many good results. But if you can use their fragile units and annoying movement tricks to the max, then they can get some very good results indeed and take down the strongest things. The Eldar do seem to have had a bit of a surge in popularity recently, perhaps still coasting off the wave of recent kits that they had about a year ago. They're currently the 5th most popular played army in tournaments, which is a fair bit higher than they used to be before. In terms of the faction strength, the Eldar are very fast. They've got lots of potent units that can move very quickly and then hit the enemy really quite hard with buffs. Typically most armies tend to revolve around some decent buffing Farseers and Warlocks, making the units hit much harder and their enemies easier to kill. And the Codex in general does have a lot of mechanics that mean that you can basically hit your foe but then hide out of line of sight while doing so. Things like battle focus, move, shoot, moving, swooping hawks jumping on and off the board at will, and some okay ignores line of sight options like those scary support weapon D cannons. Most of the aspect warriors tend to be really quite powerful as well. Things like howling banshees, striking scorpions, swooping hawks and shining spears are all great. They can get some pretty fun upgrades as well from their Exarch powers and relics. As for downsides of the army, in general I'd say they struggle a fair bit on objectives. For the primary ones, they just don't really have a lot of units they really want to leave exposed on objectives that aren't just going to get deleted pretty easily. It perhaps means that there's a bit more reliability on just tabling the opponents, really using their good movement to bring their damage to bear and destroy the enemy army so they can't score. Their unique secondaries aren't particularly exciting either, though they aren't really too bad at doing the core book secondaries with lots of fast moving units to jump around the table, so I guess it's a bit more of a mixed blessing there. They also really won't like the armies that can potentially reach their fragile units and kill them first. Things like decent amount of ignores line of sight firepower like guard mortars can be pretty annoying, as can enemy armies that just move very fast or potentially have pop up and deal damage mechanics like Genestealer Cults. In terms of recent changes for them, they got a few points shuffled around in Arks of Omen, some small nerfs to some key units, but things like cheaper Shroud Runners, and people do seem to be taking a few more of those now. Unless you're playing Ynnari, which definitely are popular, then Hail of Doom and Ulthway still seem to be the way to go. Hail of Doom's murderous strokes and damage, particularly with things like Dire Avengers, still having a great amount of success. In 7th place, we've got the Greenskins. The Orks do seem to be remaining to do well in Arks of Omen. They've been sat fairly stably on a win percent of around 53%, and have taken down 3 grand tournaments in Arks of Omen so far. Again, they're another popular faction, 6th most played in Arks of Omen at the moment. Again, some fairly solid numbers there. Orcs these days, as 9th edition has progressed, have generally been more and more about melee. The vast majority of their armies play Goths, with Death Scores perhaps being the 2nd most popular clan for a bunch of objective secured Orcs, but just all that extra strength and exploding 6s to hit in combat generally is too much to pass up for most lists. Most top armies choose to build around the War buff, so getting the 5+ invul save, plus the strength, attack, and extra advance and charge that you get for it. And after a fair few points alterations, I feel like a fair amount of the codex is actually kinda usable. Lots of different melee damage dealers are pretty tempting to pick up for the army, anything from knobs and mega knobs, all flavours of boys, storm boys, commandos, and squighog boys too. Generally you want a fair amount of Gretchen to do objectives like that good get the good bits one. Bosses can be made incredibly fighty with brutal but cunning, and the psychic powers of weird boys are pretty nice as well to give your units +1 attack and jump them across the board. For downsides of the army, morale is a bit of an issue for plenty of Orky units. Any units taken in big numbers are at pretty big danger of you losing a few casualties to that, and as they attack across the board, generally a lot of things are going to be taking chip damage here and there, bad saves, and relying on toughness just to be the main thing that stops them getting killed can be a little bit on the unreliable side. In recent times in Arks of Omen, things have generally been getting a bit better for them. A lot of their biggest competitors were nerfed a bit. Things like Ork choppers are a bit more threatening now as well, that not everyone's got Armour of Contempt. And as for their points adjustments, things like the Knob squads particularly stand out now. They're very cheap with the power claws, jumping out of battle wagons, and killer cans are a decent amount more usable too. Nice to see the greenskins doing well, and doing it with good and proper Orky combat as well. In 6th place, we've got the Death Cult Space Elves of the Ynnari. It is probably worth talking about them differently to the Craftworlds when they get good. They can take a mix of the 3 different Eldari factions, backing up the Craftworlds with some Harlequins and Drukhari. They're currently on a 54% win percentage, have won 3 grand tournaments in Arks of Omen, and that's really quite impressive considering they're one of the least played armies in current 40k, fairly niche without an enormous following. For the most part, I'd say their greatest strengths are the power of the avatar of the Incarn itself, really strong melee with ignores invuls, some useful psychic powers, and some really nasty gamey shenanigans with jumping around the board when units die. The Revenant Discipline psychic powers are kinda good for empowering melee and debuffing enemies, and just in general the combat boost with things like Drukhari combat units like Hellions or Harlequin troops is perhaps one of the biggest draws to running the army as Ynnari in the first place. As for downsides, I'd say they're broadly similar to the Craftworlds, lots of fairly fragile units that if you can engage them they will fold easily, and they might have some difficulty with scoring some primary and secondary objectives. In general though, they do seem to be doing rather well, maybe a little bit less hyper-focused on Harlequin troops now they don't get their 4+ invul saves. A few more lists seem to be playing around with some other Drukhari units and things, but overall it looks like they're remaining very, very solid for their small number of players. In 5th place on the list, we've got the Golden Host of the Adeptus Custodes. They've been incredibly strong out of the gate in Arks of Omen, on around the same win percentage as the Ynnari with 54%, and taking down 4 grand tournaments. They perhaps seem to be the go-to competitive army of Warhammer 40k at the moment, as they're the most played army in Arks of Omen, unless you lump literally all the different Space Marine chapter codexes together. Perhaps they're quite popular as they're a fairly low barrier to entry type faction, and they got a very nice Christmas box which probably encouraged a few more people to play them. As armies go, I'd say they're at least relatively easy to use in game. High saves and toughness and good quality attacks and a bit of shooting makes them perhaps a little bit more forgiving to play than some other factions, though I think they still have plenty of ways where people who know them well will shine through a bit better. The martial Qatar and flexing them around with their stratagems can give them a lot of options in game, and the Emperor's Chosen do seem to be remaining the shield host of choice. I guess they've not exactly got much worse, seeing as their esteemed amalgam stratagem is now delimited. Again, that can allow armies of Emperor's Chosen Custodes with a crazy amount of special rules if they need to pick them up. For solid units, lists often tend to be led by Trajan Valoris plus a Dawn Eagle jet bike captain. Otherwise, the Virtus Praetor bikes, the Alarus Terminators, some Foot Custodians and Forge World Dreadnoughts are often list staples. As for downsides for them, I'd say that their unique secondaries aren't really particularly good, and perhaps one of their most tempting ones is a bit of a coin flip as to whether you go first or second for whether it's easy or not. They also maybe don't get on particularly well with armies that have a lot of -1 damage, like maybe Death Guard. A lot of their attacks tend to be damaged too on their shooting and combat weapons. In terms of recent developments though, in general Arks of Omen have been very kind for them, giving Obsec back to Wardens and the Alarus Custodians was really quite big for them, and the Terminators are now a very popular pick. Having a fairly huge amount more Space Marines in the meta probably isn't the worst for them either. With all that damage too, and also some high AP melee, they generally tend to match up against them fairly well. Overall, it's a fairly good time to be a Golden Guardian of Terror. Ranked in 4th place, and pretty much having gone nowhere since their appearance on this list in the last season, the Chaos Demons appear to be maintaining a good win percent of 55% at tournaments, having taken down 5 grand tournaments, really quite a lot of them a couple of weeks back, and they also seem to be one of the more popular armies to play at tournaments these days, around about the 4th most played army in Arks of Omen at the moment, really quite big considering it's a fairly niche army. The story of the Chaos Demons and Nephilim was basically being carried by just one broken datasheet in the Flamers of Tzeentch. Games Workshop seemed to have been fairly kind for them though. The Flamers no longer auto-hit, which was a fairly big nerf for them, but it does seem that they're still a pretty competitive unit for the Demons. Plus they got handed a whole load of buffs to other units and things like cheaper Fiends and Fleshhounds being perhaps particularly tempting. For the faction strengths, they do play rather differently to quite a lot of factions in the game. They're fairly melee focused, without an enormous amount of firepower, but to keep them safe in the ranged game, their demon saves are better against ranged attacks, and they don't care about any high AP things, so lots of Melter being in the meta is kind of good for them. For demon armies, a lot of battle lines seem to revolve around Khorne units and Slaanesh demonettes plus fiends. They've got a good cast of characters in the HQ section, and maybe greater demons like Bloodthirsters, the Lord of Change, and the Dark Master Be'lakor are perhaps some of the best units to use as big threats if you want them. They've got the Warp Storm to help try and keep them a little bit more safe at range with -1 to hit as well. Their manifestation can allow them to throw demons at the enemy kind of out of nowhere, and Aura of Terror to debuff leadership is actually kind of handy against certain armies like say Orks. For downsides and counters, anything that has big deep strike denial can sometimes be bad news for them. Space Marine infiltrators won't be particularly liked, normal things like Admech techno-archaeologists or Imperial Guard commissar orders. They'll generally be quite resilient against high AP things, but mass low volume fire will whittle them down fairly reliably, and they don't have the most huge amount of selection of ranged units either, though skull cannons and flamers aren't terrible. In general, despite a few annoyances in Arks of Omen, like their Warp Storm table not working quite as well, now you can't get multiple detachments, the Chaos Demons still seem to be doing absolutely fine, and I feel like Games Workshop have in general improved their codex a fair bit, by not making them quite so ridiculously incentivized just to spam 3 units of flamers and have that be a massive part of your list. Moving onwards and upwards, in 3rd place we have the Iron Hands. Sometimes I think it makes sense to rank the Codex Space Marine chapters kinda together, but I feel like at the moment with Iron Hands operating quite so differently, they do deserve their own placement. Currently the Iron Hands chapter is on a 56% win percentage in Arks of Omen. They've taken down 5 grand tournaments, and have become the 9th most played army in the game. This one was maybe fairly predictable from Games Workshop's doctrine changes for Space Marines. Allowing them to sit in their Devastator doctrine all game long just makes them one of the best choices for running about half the units in Codex Space Marines. They're pretty excellent with just about any vehicle, and certainly any infantry on foot with heavy weapons gets enormous value out of them, being able to move and shoot with no penalty, and get the extra AP of the Devastator doctrine, and even reroll ones to hit as well. It makes them excellent with drop pod devastators, eradicators with heavy melter rifles, landspeeder storms with heavy weapon and sniper rifle scouts, landspeeders and attack bikes in the fast attack slot, and literally just about any vehicle that you can think of, whether it's dreadnoughts or tanks. Their raw damage output and their mobility with it is very, very good, and then they back that up with some fairly decent support options within the codex as well. Nice psychic powers like ones to make vehicles shoot straighter, or Steel armor to make units tougher, some very good warlord traits and stratagems, and the ability to create a character contempt to dreadnoughts to have some scary Volkite and missile launcher shooting that the enemy can't directly hit back. As for downsides, maybe Iron Hands are kind of exemplifying Space Marines as just great big damage dealers, throwing massive amounts of firepower at the opponent, but their units maybe not so hard to kill on return after the Alpha Strike. Without Armor of Contempt, removing a 5-man squad of Space Marines really isn't all that hard these days, not with all the high AP and damage 2 shooting in the game. They've also got a fair bit fewer melee synergies than most chapters, though you can mitigate it a bit by using successors and say Whirlwind of Rage, but even with that they're not going to be hitting as hard in combat as things like Space Wolves or Blood Angels. Overall, not really too hard to see why they're doing so much better than the other Space Marine chapters and Arks of Omen. The Devastator Doctrine and the big heavy weapon handout was pretty excellent for them, and they can also make really quite efficient use of that secondary objective for killing units in the right doctrine. They still get 2 victory points for each one in the Devastator doctrine for some reason, despite being very happy to sit in that one all game and shoot away. Moving up, and 2nd place on the list, we have the Genestealer Cults. They've infiltrated their way towards the top of Warhammer 40K since Arks of Omen. They were kind of doing fairly middling in Nephilim, but it does seem that they're having really quite a good time right now, with a few small improvements to their secondaries, a few points cuts, but perhaps just a lot of the other threats with some really big damage being taken down a peg by the nerfs. In Arks of Omen, they've got a 58% win percentage, they've won 2 grand tournaments, and again, they've done rather well for how often they're taken in Warhammer 40k. They're the 18th most played army in Arks of Omen, and again, that means that 2 wins just for that level is pretty strong. Genestealer Cults are again an army that plays really quite different to most others, pretty much the guerrilla warfare army. They deploy hidden, so are quite good at reacting to however their opponents set up. Lots of units will typically be in their ambush reserve where they can get dangerously close and either blast away at exposed targets with crossfire or hope for some 8-inch charges with some insanely damaging weapons, and then layer on a whole load of slightly game-breaking tricks from their proficient planning, all of which does cost points, but it does mean that they have some serious options. You can have units popping up 3 inches away from the enemy, getting big damage boosts on the first round of combat, or first turn charges with pure strain Genestealers. For the most part, the main damage dealing of the list tends to be done by Neophytes and Acolytes and the pure strains, all of those supported by a decent cast of HQs and characters like the pistol-toting Kellamorph, a couple of Jackal Bikers to screen and gain advantages in the early game, and maybe some Goliath trucks or rock grinders to transport some units. In terms of cults, both Twisted Helix and the custom cults are seeing quite a lot of play at the moment. Twisted Helix is what you'd want to go for melee. Ignoring heavy weapon penalties with the custom cults though is rather good as well, and there's plenty of other ways that you can put further twists on them. I feel like all of this is balanced somewhat by being a fairly hard faction to play in general. Most of the units do tend to be really quite fragile for how many points that they cost, and if they're not using all their gamey tricks to their maximum advantage, they're often just going to turn up, kill something, and not quite make their points back, and then just get removed fairly effortlessly in return. With Genestealer Cults, I feel like small mistakes and bits of bad luck like failing a key charge can be really quite punishing. If the opponent's able to get something like an unexpected line of sight on something, then it really could be pretty crucial. In terms of recent developments for them, their points cuts might have helped out a little bit. Things like the primers got cheaper, which was kind of unexpected but helpful. Aberrants still don't seem to be used very much though, even in Twisted Helix, though I do feel that they now compete really quite a lot better for their points cost. In general though, clearly in the right hands they're a very powerful army, generally able to dictate the flow of the game quite well, and usually will score fairly highly win or lose with all their small units running around with gamey deep strike mechanics. At the moment it's a good time to be a servant of the four-armed Emperor. Lastly, and kind of in joint first in terms of win percentages, at 58% we have the Dark Angels, much more commonly played than the Genestealer Cult, and having taken down 7 tournaments, it does seem that the Sons of Caliban are getting all very excited for the return of their Primarch, and seem to be on best behaviour with the Xenos and Heretic smashing. Again, the Dark Angels were just enormous winners out of all of the Arks of Omen changes for Space Marines, both the Deathwing and Ravenwing getting massive power boosts. Deathwing gets Transhuman Thunderhammer and Storm Shield units for just 33 points per model, and then throw in some Cyclone missile launchers, Watchers in the Dark, and strong support. Ravenwing get All-Game Devastator Doctrine, so a super fast moving with the extra 3-inch move, better AP on their heavy weapons like Talonmaster Assault Cannons, the ability to advance all game long to unlock 4+ invul saves from Jink, and also some really nice points cuts to things like Black Knights, Land Speeders, and Attack Bikes. They can support all that with Samael and some really nice stratagems as well, and the 2 wings together make a really nice hammer and anvil, the Raven Wing zooming around just deleting things, and the Deathwing being incredibly tanky and very scary to approach as they stomp onto objectives, maybe with Rites of War to give them obsec. They can get some good support with things like Psychic Powers from Ezekiel and Warlord traits as well, plus get a fast moving Ravenwing Apothecary for some healing, and a big plasma stratagem option as well if you want to really cook some things with Black Knight damage 3 plasma shots. Obviously they're currently having a very good time of it. I guess if I had to nitpick weaknesses, the Deathwing can be a bit unwieldy to bring to bear, and if the Ravenwing get a little bit too greedy, they could potentially be countercharged or hit back hard if the Alpha Strike doesn't hurt too much. Plus they did have a few small niggles from Arks of Omen, like not being able to run their own Deathwing or Ravenwing Vanguard attachments anymore. You have to commit to the entire army if you want the bonus obsec. In general though, the changes have just worked out very very nicely for them, and are currently arguably one of the very strongest armies in Warhammer 40k. So anyway, there we have it, a rundown of some of the strongest armies in Warhammer 40k at the moment, and why they're doing so well. Let me know your thoughts or any armies that you'd be tempted to rate a bit higher or lower than this. I look forward to hearing your ideas down in the comments. Finally, if you've been enjoying all the videos on the channel, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll be hoping to make a follow-up video to this to examine the tail end of the 40k meta in the near future, so feel free to subscribe or check back later if you'd like to see that. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and that's how I can afford to make quite so many videos like this quite so regularly. If you have been enjoying a lot, then any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.